Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be speaking here today. In 2018, I started to do research about some of the challenges that the people in my country, Uganda, were facing. And I remember getting to learn that climate change was one of those challenges. It is something that I had obviously, seen in school, read about in school, but I didn't really carry the urgency of the challenge. But when I read these impacts and how they're already affecting the lives of the people in my country, Uganda, I knew that this was a huge challenge and I had to do something about it. I remember seeing that some of these impacts, like the flooding, the droughts, they were already affecting the lives of so many people in Uganda, and something needed to be done. For me, that was my beginning understanding how urgent the climate crisis was and how it was already impacting lives and livelihoods in so many communities. In that time, the Fridays for Future strikes had been started by Greta from Sweden. And when I saw Greta striking, I felt so inspired to do the same thing to raise awareness about the impact of climate change in my country. I made a decision to start going out to the street and holding signs and placards to raise awareness and also to share what we were doing in Uganda on social media, because in a way, with social media, we could reach a bigger audience and more people, even beyond Uganda. I remember holding my very first strike with my siblings and my cousins. And actually, my first strike was on a Sunday. When I made the decision to start striking for the climate, I didn't start immediately because I was worried and scared about going to the street and nervous about it. But I finally made the decision to start striking. But when I made the decision, I realized it was already a Saturday. And I had this urgency in my heart that I had to strike and raise awareness. So I decided that I would start striking on Sunday and then join the rest of the youth activists every Friday for the following weeks. And in the journey, we saw the birth of Youth for Future. Youth for Future was a group that I put together with different activists. Most of them were my friends from university. Remember at that time in 2019, the environmental movement, the way it was being reported, the climate strikes, it made some of my friends feel like, they cannot join the climate strikes since they were not in high school anymore. So I asked them if we can call ourselves Youth for Future and continue to strike with the rest of the groups in different parts of the world. So that is how Youth for Future came about in Uganda. So we started organizing strikes. They were much smaller than the strikes that we see in the countries within Europe because of some of the challenges that we've seen in organizing very big strikes. We started to reach out to schools as well and carry out climate education with the students. We knew that there was a big gap and many students didn't really understand the impact of climate change. And many of them didn't even know the role that they could play in either organizing or speaking to their parents or speaking to their teachers about climate change and about what needs to be done. So we really thought it was important to reach out to schools, to carry out climate education, to reach out to communities. One thing I remember from communities, reaching out to communities, and it's almost the same thing even up to today, is that not everyone will understand the language of 1.5. But for many people, they will understand that climate change is affecting their access to food or it is affecting their farms, or their crops for their water sources. So that made me really understand that even as much as we talk about climate education, we have to be careful about the language that we use in different communities or when we are speaking to different people, because not everyone will know what 1.5 is. Not everyone will know what the science of climate change is, but many people will understand that because of the changes in weather patterns, their farms are being affected. Their families are facing strains on some of the basic necessities of life. Along the way, we started the Rise Up movement as well. And Rise Up movement was really to create a platform that would amplify the voices of different activists across Africa. With Youth for Future, we were mostly working within Uganda. And with Rise Up movement, we started to connect with different activists in different African countries. And we wanted to really raise this platform for African voices. Many times African voices are referred to as missing voices, but we are not missing voices. It's just that there are no platforms. There's few people amplifying these voices. We knew that every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. So that is how Rise Up movement came about. And with Rise Up movement, we've been able to, find opportunities for activists through media to tell their stories, and also through conferences. Because for last year itself, we did have a delegation from Rise Up to go to the Stockholm Plus 50 and also to go to COP27 in Egypt. And it's really important that no one is left behind in our fight for climate justice, especially people from the communities that are least responsible for climate change. And our messages, have always been clear from the beginning until now, and mostly to tell our leaders, to tell the people to listen to the science. The IPCC has made it very clear that if we are to stay safe, if we are to stay within safe climate limits, then we cannot have any new oil and gas projects. The IEA has also been very clear about no new fossil fuels if we are to limit global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has repeatedly said that any new investments in fossil fuels would be moral and economic madness. And he said the business models of fossil fuel companies are inconsistent with human survival. And we've seen that. We've seen the impacts of the climate crisis. And we've seen how much stress and fear it has caused in so many people, unsure about the kind of future that they walk into because of our present that is already very catastrophic. Along the way, we started to understand some of the intersections of climate change as well, to understand that climate change was more than weather, and it is more than statistics, it is more than numbers, and it is about the people. In understanding the intersection of climate change, it helps us bring people at the center of the conversation. It helps us bring or put people on these numbers, on these statistics. It's very easy for people to read statistics and move on, but it's another to really understand that with every statistic, there is an individual, there is a family, there is a community. And one of the most, important intersections I've seen of climate change, have really been on poverty eradication, for example. When I started my activism, some of the people would tell me, why don't you advocate to eradicate poverty. But as I read more about climate change, because it was completely a new, a new topic to me. I was a business student at university. So it's not like I had a lot of knowledge about environmental issues. These are things that I got to learn in my journey of activism. And one of the things I learned was we can't eradicate poverty without addressing climate change. Because as families lose their livelihoods, as families are displaced, as families are losing their farms, their businesses, their sources of income, they're being pushed into poverty traps, which poverty traps are being passed on from generation to generation. I also remember reading an article that was talking about climate brides, something that I would never think of. But it explained how, for many families in Africa, when they are faced with climate disasters, when they cannot, when they've lost their source of income and they don't have the basic necessities to support their children, one, they are forced to remove their children from school. And there is always a priority on who stays in school and who leaves school. And in this article, it explained how many times it is the girl children that are dropping out of school as climate disasters escalate. It explained how families are forced to put their children, girls, into early marriages with the expectation of a bride price that can help them recover from climate impacts. So I got to understand how climate change is actually exacerbating child marriages in certain parts of the world. It is leading to school dropouts in certain parts of the world. But you cannot think of this if you're only looking at climate change in the direction of numbers and statistics, and if you haven't put the human face in this conversation. When you talk about conflict and how the depleting resources and how communities are now having to fight over the little resources that they have as water sources are drying up. We're not just seeing women having to walk long distances, but we're seeing communities having to struggle for the limited resources that they have. Talk about, achieving zero hunger. Climate change is exacerbating food insecurities in different parts of the world, from floods destroying people's farms to droughts drying crops. Last year, I was able to visit Turkana region. It's one of the regions that is being impacted by the drought in the Horn of Africa, the worst drought that it has seen in 40 years, a drought that has left so many women and so many children struggling to find something to eat, because most of the people I interacted with in that visit were mothers and children. Many of them explained how the fathers had moved with the animals to try and get pasture and find water for the animals. So many women were left alone with their children who were sick, and they were trying to keep their children alive. I remember visiting a hospital where the worst cases of severe acute malnutrition are referred and treated. And there are so many children receiving treatment. But one child that I remember meeting, he was with his grandmother. He was in a situation that the doctors referred to as a wasted situation. And it was very unlikely that he would survive. He was receiving treatment, but there was really no hope that he could survive. And by the time the sun set that evening, he had passed away. It just made me see how climate change is not just a future threat, it is happening right now. It isn't just robbing people of their future, it is robbing them of their present. It is robbing them of their survival. And that's why we need to do something. We need to understand these intersections. We need to understand climate change beyond the numbers on our screens, beyond the statistics, but to really put a human face on the conversation. But with what I've seen, with the youth movement, the mobilizing and the organizing of millions of young people, it has really, really given me hope to keep fighting, to know that another world is not only necessary for all of us, but it's actually possible. I have seen, different youth activists running projects in their communities, transforming their communities, even with the little resources that they have, bringing change one step at a time, but while also holding leaders accountable and pushing them for more systematic change. I did start a project that involves the installation of solar panels and clean cooking stoves in schools in Uganda. And this was to help schools reduce on their consumption of firewood. This was to help schools have basic access to electricity. And when this project started, we didn't know how many schools we could reach, but we just hoped we would reach as many schools as possible. And so far, we've reached 51 schools in Uganda, impacting the lives of about 19,000 children, and hoping to scale up the project in the DRC and reach more children as well, with these installations. So it is these, actions of different young people across the world that really give me hope in this fight. But we cannot do this alone. We need everyone involved. We need everyone involved. The planet doesn't just belong to young people. It doesn't just belong to youth activists. It belongs to you. It belongs to me. It belongs to all of us. And if it belongs to all of us, that means it's our home, and that means it's a responsibility for all of us. And that means that we should work and hold our leaders accountable. We should push for no new fossil fuel investment and push for scaling up of renewables, because that is the balance. No new fossil fuels and yes to renewables, while addressing the energy, the energy poverty in many countries in the global south, addressing issues of climate finance, mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. We saw the establishment of a loss and damage fund at COP27 in Egypt, but this is still an empty fund that needs money that can reach people that are suffering some of the worst impacts of climate change. And as I finish, I would like to share about a book that I wrote, A Bigger Picture. And this book talks about, of course, my experience as an activist, and how it's just amazing, because I think the very first time I got to learn about the word activist was when I joined the climate movement. I don't think it had ever crossed my vocabulary. I don't think the word activism had ever crossed my vocabulary. But with a bigger picture, I tell my story, and not just my story, but the story of how Youth for Future was formed, Rise Up movement, and how we've worked with different activists in Uganda and different activists across Africa and across the world to really push and fight for a better world for all of us. But one of the beautiful things about A Bigger Picture is that it tells other stories as well. Every activist has a story to tell. And with whatever platform that we get, we must give the opportunity, we must pass the mic, we must pass the platform to other people to tell their stories as well. For me, that is what will ensure that we leave no one behind. That is what will ensure that we leave no community behind. That is what will ensure, that the world that we are all fighting for is not only necessary, but it's actually possible, it is achievable and attainable. Thank you so much.